The porcelain plate slipped from Penelope Harrison's trembling fingers and shattered across the wooden floorboards of the saloon kitchen, the crash echoing through the tense silence like a gunshot. And she knew with absolute certainty that her husband would make her pay for this mistake in blood and bruises. Vernon Harrison's face turned crimson as he advanced on his wife, his meaty fists already clenched at his sides. The other workers in the kitchen of the Dusty Trail Saloon scattered like tumbleweeds in a windstorm, nobody willing to intervene in what had become an all-too-familiar scene in San Elizario, Texas, this summer of 1878. Penelope barely had time to raise her arms defensively before Vernon's hand connected with her cheek, the force of the blow sending her sprawling against the counter. "You worthless woman!" Vernon roared, grabbing her by her auburn hair and yanking her upright. "Do you have any idea how much those plates cost? Every damn thing you touch turns to ruin." Tears streamed down Penelope's face as she struggled against his grip, but at 22 years old and barely over 100 pounds, she was no match for her husband's brutal strength. Vernon raised his fist again, and Penelope squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for another impact that would leave her face swollen and discolored for days. The blow never came. Instead, she heard a sharp intake of breath from Vernon, followed by a voice she had never heard before, low and steady as the Rio Grande on a calm day. "That will be quite enough." Penelope opened her eyes to see a tall cowboy standing in the kitchen doorway, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair fell just past his collar, and despite the trail dust covering his clothes, there was something undeniably commanding about his presence. Vernon released Penelope's hair but puffed up his chest in false bravado. "This is none of your concern, stranger. What happens between a man and his wife is private business." The cowboy took 3 measured steps into the kitchen, and Penelope noticed the slight limp in his left leg, as though he had been injured sometime in the past. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that made even Vernon hesitate. "I am making it my concern. Step away from her. Now." "Who the hell do you think you are?" Vernon sputtered, but Penelope could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Her husband was a bully who preyed on those weaker than himself, but he had never been particularly brave when facing someone who could fight back. "My name is Fletcher Irons," the cowboy said simply, "and I have just witnessed you strike a defenseless woman over an accident. In my book, that makes you lower than a snake's belly. So I will say this one more time. Step away from her and walk out of this kitchen. If you so much as look at her wrong again, you and I are going to have a serious problem." Vernon's face cycled through several shades of red and purple before he apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He jabbed a finger at Penelope. "This is not over, wife. You will pay for embarrassing me like this." Fletcher Irons moved so quickly that Penelope barely tracked the motion. One moment he was standing near the doorway, the next he had Vernon pressed against the wall with one forearm across his throat. "Listen very carefully," Fletcher said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will not touch her again. You will not threaten her again. You will not so much as breathe in her direction in a way that makes her uncomfortable. Because if you do, I will hear about it, and I will find you. Do we have an understanding?" Vernon made a strangled sound that might have been agreement, and Fletcher released him. The larger man stumbled toward the door, shooting venomous looks at both Penelope and her unexpected defender before disappearing into the saloon's main room. Penelope sagged against the counter, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Fletcher was at her side in an instant, his strong hand steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Easy now," he said softly. "You are safe. He will not hurt you again." "You do not know Vernon," Penelope whispered, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. "He will be furious. He will make me regret this." Fletcher guided her to a wooden chair and crouched down so he could look into her eyes. Up close, Penelope could see the small scar above his left eyebrow and the weathered lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of long days spent under the merciless Texas sun. "I meant what I said, miss. You will never be hit again. Not while I am drawing breath." "Mrs." Penelope corrected automatically, touching the simple gold band on her finger with a gesture that was more habit than affection. "Mrs. Harrison." Something flickered in Fletcher's storm-gray eyes, disappointment perhaps, but he simply nodded. "Mrs. Harrison." "Do you have somewhere safe you can go? Family? Friends?" Penelope shook her head miserably. She had married Vernon 3 years ago when she was just 19, a foolish girl who had mistaken his possessive attention for love. Her parents had both died of fever the previous winter, and she had no siblings. Vernon had systematically isolated her from what few friends she had managed to make in San Elizario, and now she found herself utterly alone except for the violent man who called himself her husband. "I have nowhere," she admitted quietly. "Vernon owns this saloon. I work here to earn my keep, he says, though I never see a penny of wages. If I leave, I would have nothing. No money, no prospects, no references for other employment." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were chewing over some difficult decision. Finally, he stood and held out his hand to her. "Come with me." Penelope stared at his outstretched hand as though it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "I cannot just leave." "Vernon will never allow it." "Vernon Harrison does not get a say in the matter," Fletcher replied firmly. "I have a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. It is not much, just a small spread with maybe 50 head of cattle, but I could use help with the household work. I will pay you fair wages, provide room and board, and I give you my word as a gentleman that you will be treated with respect." "You do not even know me," Penelope said, bewildered by this stranger's kindness. "Why would you do this?" Fletcher's expression softened. "My mother was married to a man like your husband. My real father died when I was just a baby, and she remarried a few years later, thinking she was doing what was best for me. But her second husband had a cruel streak a mile wide. I watched him beat her for years, always finding some excuse, some reason why she deserved his fists. I was too young to stop him, too small to protect her. By the time I was big enough to fight back, she had already taken her own life to escape him." Penelope's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Fletcher, I am so sorry." "I swore on her grave that I would never stand by and watch another man brutalize a woman," Fletcher continued, his voice rough with old pain. "So when I say you will never be hit again, I mean it with everything I am. Now please, take my hand. Let me help you the way I could not help my mother." Penelope looked into those earnest gray eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and a bone-deep determination to make good on his promise. She thought about the years of marriage that stretched behind her, each one darker than the last, and the prospect of more years ahead filled with fear and pain. Then she thought about this cowboy who had appeared like an answer to prayers she had been too beaten down to even whisper. She placed her hand in his. Fletcher's fingers closed around hers with gentle strength, and he pulled her to her feet. "Do you have any belongings you need to collect?" "Just a few things in the room Vernon and I share upstairs," Penelope said. "Some clothes, my mother's Bible, a few personal items. Go get them quickly," Fletcher instructed. "I will wait here and make sure your husband does not interfere." Penelope hurried up the back stairs to the cramped room above the saloon that had been her prison for the past 3 years. Her hands shook as she pulled a worn carpet bag from beneath the iron bed frame and began stuffing her meager possessions inside. She owned 4 dresses, 2 nightgowns, some undergarments, a pair of boots, and the precious leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her mother. She also grabbed the small wooden box that contained the only photograph she had of her parents, taken shortly before they succumbed to the fever. As she was closing the carpet bag, the door burst open and Vernon stormed in, his face twisted with rage. "Going somewhere, wife?" Penelope clutched the bag to her chest and backed toward the window. "I am leaving, Vernon. I am going to work for Mr. Irons at his ranch." Vernon laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You stupid girl. You think that Cowboy is being noble. He just wants what every man wants from a woman like you. At least I had the decency to marry you first." "You have never shown me a single day of decency in our entire marriage," Penelope said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You have hit me, belittled me, and made me feel worthless. Whatever Fletcher Irons wants from me, it cannot be worse than what you have put me through." Vernon's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "You are not going anywhere. You are my wife, and you will do as I say." Before Penelope could cry out, Fletcher appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and broke Vernon's grip on Penelope with one sharp motion. "I believe the lady made herself clear," he said, positioning himself between Penelope and her husband. "She is leaving. You can either accept that with dignity, or I can make this very unpleasant for you." Vernon's hand twitched toward the knife he kept sheathed at his belt, but Fletcher's revolver was in his hand before the other man could even close his fingers around the hilt. "I would not recommend it," Fletcher said mildly. "I spent 4 years as a cavalry scout during the war with the Comanche. My aim is quite good." The standoff lasted for several tense seconds before Vernon finally backed down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he spat. "Take the worthless woman. See how long it takes before you realize what a burden she is." Fletcher kept his gun trained on Vernon as he gestured for Penelope to move past him toward the door. "Go on down to the stable out back. I have a horse there, a gray mare named Silver. Wait for me there." Penelope did not need to be told twice. She hurried out of the room, down the back stairs, and out into the blazing afternoon sun. The stable was easy to find, and inside she discovered a beautiful dappled gray mare with intelligent dark eyes. The horse whickered softly as Penelope approached, and she tentatively reached out to stroke the mare's soft nose. "You are Silver," she murmured. "You are beautiful. Your owner is a very brave man." It was another 5 minutes before Fletcher joined her, and Penelope had spent every one of those minutes terrified that she would hear gunshots from above. But Fletcher appeared unharmed, holstering his revolver as he entered the stable. "I had a few more words with your husband," he said. "I do not think he will trouble you further, but just in case, we should leave town quickly." He saddled Silver with practiced efficiency, then surprised Penelope by leading the mare to a mounting block and helping her up into the saddle first. "You ride up front," he said. "I will sit behind you and handle the reins. The ranch is about an hour's ride from here." Penelope had not been on a horse in years, not since before her marriage, but she found the gentle swaying motion comforting as Fletcher swung up behind her. His arms came around her on either side to grip the reins, and Penelope was intensely aware of his solid presence at her back, warm and protective. They rode out of San Elizario, heading northwest, following a dusty trail that wound through scrubland dotted with mesquite and prickly pear cactus. The summer heat was oppressive, but a dry breeze provided some relief as Silver carried them steadily away from the town and everything Penelope had known for the past 3 years. "Tell me about your ranch," Penelope said after they had been riding for a while, partly because she was genuinely curious and partly because the silence was making her nervous. "It is called the Ironwood Ranch," Fletcher replied, his voice rumbling pleasantly near her ear. "I inherited it from my uncle 2 years ago when he passed. He never married, never had children, so he left the whole spread to me. It is not much compared to some of the bigger ranches in Texas, just about 300 acres with a small house, a barn, and decent grazing land. I run cattle mostly, though I have been thinking about getting some horses to train and sell." "It sounds wonderful," Penelope said wistfully. "I have not lived anywhere with open space since I was a girl. My parents had a small farm in Missouri before we moved to Texas." "What brought you all the way out here?" Fletcher asked. "My father heard there was good land available and better opportunities," Penelope explained. "We settled in San Elizario 5 years ago, but my parents never recovered their health after the move. The fever took them both within days of each other last year. I was already married to Vernon by then, though sometimes I think my father regretted pushing me toward that match. He died with worry in his eyes." Fletcher's arms tightened almost imperceptibly around her. "I am sorry for your losses. But I am glad you are away from that man now. No one deserves to live in fear." They rode on in companionable silence, and Penelope found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation. There was something fundamentally decent about Fletcher Irons, something that made her trust him even though they had only just met. Perhaps it was the way he had stood up to Vernon without hesitation, or the gentleness in his hands despite the obvious strength in his body. Or perhaps it was simply that after 3 years of cruelty, any kindness felt like a miracle. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Fletcher guided Silver off the main trail onto a smaller path that led through a grove of cottonwood trees. "We are almost there," he said. "Just over this rise." They crested a small hill, and Penelope gasped at the sight that greeted her. The Ironwood Ranch spread out below them like something from a painting. The house was modest but well-maintained, built from honey-colored adobe with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. The barn was similarly constructed, and Penelope could see a corral with several horses moving about. Beyond the buildings, the land rolled away in gentle waves of golden grass, and in the distance, she could see the dark shapes of cattle grazing peacefully. "It is beautiful," Penelope breathed. Fletcher seemed pleased by her reaction. "I am glad you think so. Come on, let me show you the house." He dismounted first, then helped Penelope down, his hands steady at her waist. She was acutely aware of the strength in his grip, and the way he did not release her immediately, as though making sure she was steady on her feet before letting go. The inside of the house was just as appealing as the exterior. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and simple but sturdy furniture arranged throughout. Fletcher showed her down a short hallway to a small bedroom with a single bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. "This can be your room," he said. "It was my uncle's before he got too sick to manage the stairs and moved down to the main level. I have been sleeping in the room at the end of the hall. There is fresh water in the basin, and I will bring in your bag. Take whatever time you need to settle in. There is no rush." Penelope set her carpet bag on the bed and looked around the simple room that was now hers. It was smaller than the room she had shared with Vernon, but it felt infinitely larger because it represented something she had not had in years: freedom. She washed her face and hands in the basin, wincing as the cool water touched the bruise forming on her cheek. When she looked in the small mirror hanging above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her green eyes, once bright with life, looked tired and wary. Her auburn hair, which she had once worn long and loose, was pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her 22 years. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reflection. "Yes." "I am heading to the barn to tend to Silver and the other horses," Fletcher called through the door. "When I come back, I will make us some supper. You just rest for now." Penelope opened the door and looked up at him earnestly. "Fletcher, I did not come here to be a burden. You said you needed help with household work, and I intend to earn my keep. Let me make supper while you tend to the animals. I am actually quite a good cook when I am not dropping plates." A smile tugged at the corner of Fletcher's mouth, the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges and revealing the kind man beneath the stern exterior. "If you are sure you are up to it, the kitchen is reasonably well stocked. My uncle taught me to cook the basics, but I will admit that my meals tend to be pretty simple fare." "I will see what I can do," Penelope promised. Fletcher left for the barn, and Penelope explored the kitchen with growing excitement. It had been so long since she had been allowed to cook without Vernon hovering over her, ready to criticize every move. She found flour, salt, some cured bacon, eggs, potatoes, and various other staples. There were also some wild onions hanging in a basket and a jar of preserved tomatoes on a shelf. By the time Fletcher returned from the barn, Penelope had prepared a meal of fried potatoes with bacon and onions, scrambled eggs, and fresh biscuits. The smell of cooking food filled the house, and Fletcher stopped in the doorway, his expression one of surprised pleasure. "Good Lord, that smells amazing," he said. "When I said you could earn your keep, I did not expect a feast on your first night." Penelope felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment. "It is just simple food, nothing fancy. But please sit down. Everything is ready." They sat across from each other at the small wooden table, and Penelope watched nervously as Fletcher took his first bite. His eyes widened, and he immediately took another forkful. "Penelope, this is delicious. I have been eating my own cooking for 2 years, and I can tell you it does not hold a candle to this." Warmth spread through Penelope's chest at his praise. Vernon had never complimented her cooking, even on the rare occasions when he had not found something to criticize. "Thank you. My mother taught me. She said that food prepared with care is one of the best ways to show love for the people in your life." The word love seemed to hang in the air between them, and Penelope quickly looked down at her plate, embarrassed by her choice of words. But when she dared to glance up, Fletcher was simply smiling at her again with that gentle expression that made her heart do strange things in her chest. They talked as they ate, and Penelope learned more about Fletcher's life. He had grown up in Colorado, left home at 16 after his stepfather died in a brawl, and spent several years drifting through various jobs before joining the cavalry. After his service ended, he had wandered through Texas until his uncle tracked him down and invited him to the ranch. "I think Uncle Samuel knew he was dying even then," Fletcher said quietly. "He wanted to make sure someone would continue his legacy, take care of the land he had spent his life building. I am honored to carry on his work." "He would be proud of you," Penelope said. "You can see the care you put into this place." Fletcher looked at her for a long moment, and Penelope felt something shift in the air between them, some unspoken connection that made her breath catch. Then Fletcher cleared his throat and stood, beginning to gather the dishes. "Let me clean up." "You have done more than enough for one day. We can do it together," Penelope suggested, rising as well. "Many hands make light work, as my mother used to say." They washed and dried the dishes side by side, working in comfortable silence. Penelope found herself very aware of Fletcher's presence beside her, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against hers in the small space, the low sound of his humming as he worked. When the kitchen was clean, Fletcher showed her where he kept the lamp oil and helped her light the lanterns throughout the house as darkness fell. The night sounds of the ranch drifted through the open windows. Crickets chirping, the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. "I usually rise around dawn to tend to the animals," Fletcher said as they stood on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You are welcome to sleep as late as you need. There is no set schedule here, no one to scold you for taking time for yourself." Penelope shook her head. "I have been waking at dawn for years. I doubt I could sleep late even if I tried. If you do not mind, I would like to prepare breakfast for us before you head out to work." "I would like that very much," Fletcher said softly. He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight spilling from the house, his face was all angles and shadows. "Penelope, I want you to know that you are safe here. I will never raise a hand to you, never raise my voice in anger. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. I need you to believe that." Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were different from the tears she had shed in fear and pain. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that might have been the first fragile shoots of hope. "I believe you," she whispered. "And Fletcher, thank you. You saved my life today in more ways than one." Fletcher reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers were calloused from hard work but infinitely careful. "You saved yourself by having the courage to leave. I just opened the door." That night, Penelope lay in the narrow bed in her small room and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night. For the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep without fear, knowing that on the other side of the wall, a good man was watching over her. The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Penelope rose with the sun and prepared breakfast while Fletcher tended to the morning chores. They ate together, talking about the day ahead or sharing stories from their pasts. Then Fletcher would head out to work the ranch while Penelope managed the house. She threw herself into the domestic work with enthusiasm she had not felt in years. She cleaned every corner of the house, washed the curtains and bedding, organized the kitchen, and even planted a small vegetable garden near the house using seeds she found in the barn. Fletcher never criticized, never complained, only praised her efforts and thanked her sincerely for everything she did. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch together after supper, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they simply enjoyed each other's company in comfortable silence. Penelope found herself looking forward to these quiet moments with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She was falling in love with Fletcher Irons, and she had no idea what to do about it. The realization hit her about 3 weeks after she had come to the ranch. She had been in the kitchen preparing supper when Fletcher returned from checking on the herd, his shirt damp with sweat and his face flushed from the heat. He had smiled at her, that wonderful warm smile that lit up his entire face, and asked if there was anything he could do to help. And in that moment, Penelope had felt her heart simply overflow with affection for this man who had rescued her, protected her, and treated her with more kindness than she had known in years. But she was still married to Vernon Harrison. That simple gold band on her finger was a constant reminder that no matter what she felt for Fletcher, she was bound to another man by law and by the vows she had spoken before God. The thought of those vows made her physically ill now, but they were still real, still binding. Fletcher seemed to sense the change in her mood as they sat down to eat. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. "You seem troubled." Penelope considered lying, but she had discovered that she could not deceive Fletcher even when she wanted to. "I was thinking about my situation," she admitted. About Vernon and the fact that I am still legally his wife. I ran away, but that does not change the reality of my circumstances. Fletcher set down his fork and looked at her seriously. Have you thought about what you want to do? About whether you might seek a divorce? The word hung in the air between them like something dangerous and forbidden. Divorce was scandalous, nearly unthinkable for a woman in 1878 Texas. A divorced woman would be shunned by polite society, her reputation destroyed, her prospects for the future severely limited. I have thought about it, Penelope said slowly. But divorce is not easy to obtain, especially for a woman. I would need to prove that Vernon is an unfit husband, and even then, a judge might not grant it. And if I did manage to divorce him, I would be marked as a fallen woman for the rest of my life. You would not be fallen, Fletcher said fiercely. You would be free, and anyone who judges you for escaping an abusive marriage is not worth your concern. Penelope felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. You have a very optimistic view of human nature, Fletcher Irons. I have a realistic view of you, he countered. You are kind, hardworking, intelligent, and strong. You deserve a life free from fear, and if pursuing a divorce is what it takes to give you that life, then I will support you in whatever way I can. She met his eyes across the table and saw nothing but sincerity in those storm-gray depths. Why? She asked softly. Why do you care so much about what happens to me? Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, and Penelope could see him wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and intense. Because I have come to care for you a great deal, Penelope. More than I probably should, given your circumstances. But I cannot help the way I feel, and I will not insult you by pretending indifference. Penelope's breath caught in her throat. Fletcher, you do not need to say anything, he interrupted gently. I know you are still married, and I respect that. I am not asking for anything from you. I just want you to know that whatever you decide to do about your future, I will be here for you. As a friend, as an employer, or... He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished but the implication clear. I care for you too, Penelope heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I think I started caring for you that very first day when you stood up to Vernon and promised I would never be hit again. You kept that promise, Fletcher. You have given me safety and kindness and a place where I can breathe freely. How could I not care for you? Fletcher reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. Then we will figure this out together, one step at a time. There is no rush, no pressure. We will simply take each day as it comes. That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship. They did not change their daily routines, did not behave inappropriately given Penelope's married status, but there was an acknowledgement between them now of what they felt, what they hoped might be possible someday. A week later, Fletcher rode into San Elizario to purchase supplies and to discreetly inquire about divorce proceedings. He returned with a grim expression and news that was both expected and disappointing. I spoke with a lawyer in town, Fletcher said as they sat on the porch that evening. He says that Texas law does allow for divorce on grounds of cruel treatment, but you would need to file a formal petition with the court and prove that Vernon has been abusive. It could take months, possibly over a year, to resolve, and there is no guarantee that the judge would rule in your favor. Penelope nodded slowly, absorbing this information. Did Vernon happen to see you in town? Fletcher's jaw tightened. He did. He confronted me outside the general store, demanded to know where you were. I told him that was none of his business. He threatened to have the sheriff arrest me for kidnapping his wife. Fear clutched at Penelope's heart. Can he do that? Could you be arrested? The lawyer assured me that since you came with me willingly, there is no crime, Fletcher said, but Harrison could make trouble if he wanted to. The lawyer suggested that you file for divorce as soon as possible to establish your legal independence. Then, that is what I will do, Penelope said with more confidence than she felt. Will the lawyer help me prepare the necessary documents? He will. I told him we would return to town next week to begin the process. Fletcher hesitated, then added, Penelope, you should know that Harrison also said some things about you, tried to spread rumors about improper behavior between us. I set him straight in no uncertain terms, but there may be talk in town. Penelope felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. Of course Vernon would try to destroy her reputation. It was exactly the sort of petty, vindictive thing he would do. Let people talk, she said with false bravado. We know the truth. Fletcher squeezed her hand. Yes, we do, and that is all that matters. The following week, they rode into San Elizario together. Penelope was nervous about returning to town, afraid of running into Vernon or facing the judgment of people who knew her as Mrs. Harrison. But Fletcher stayed close to her side, a solid and reassuring presence as they made their way to the lawyer's office. The lawyer, a middle-aged man named Mr. Garrett, was professional and surprisingly sympathetic as he explained the divorce process to Penelope. She would need to file a formal petition stating her grounds for seeking dissolution of the marriage. They would need witnesses willing to testify to Vernon's cruel treatment. There would be a court hearing where both parties would present their cases, and finally, the judge would render a decision. I will not lie to you, Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Garrett said gravely. These cases are difficult, especially when the husband contests the divorce. Mr. Harrison has been spreading the word around town that you abandoned him to run off with your lover. That kind of accusation can be very damaging to your case. But it is not true, Penelope protested. Fletcher has been nothing but a gentleman. I am working as his housekeeper, nothing more. I believe you, Mr. Garrett said. But we will need to convince the judge, and judges tend to be conservative in matters of marriage and morality. Your best chance is to gather testimony from people who witnessed your husband's abuse. Were there others who saw him strike you? Penelope thought back to all the times Vernon had hurt her in the kitchen of the saloon, in their room upstairs, sometimes even in the street when his anger got the better of his caution. Yes, she said. There were other workers at the saloon who saw. A woman named Martha helped me sometimes after Vernon would hit me, and there was a cook named Joe who tried to intervene once, though Vernon threatened to fire him. Good, Mr. Garrett said, making notes. I will speak with these people and see if they are willing to testify. In the meantime, I will prepare your petition and file it with the court. This process is not quick, Mrs. Harrison, and it will not be easy. But if you are determined to see it through, I believe you have a fighting chance. They left the lawyer's office with Penelope feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. She had taken the first real step toward freedom, but the road ahead was long and uncertain. As they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Vernon Harrison emerged from the saloon across the street. He had clearly been drinking, and his face was flushed as he staggered toward them. There she is, he shouted, loud enough to draw attention from passers-by. My runaway wife and her cowboy lover. Fletcher immediately positioned himself between Vernon and Penelope, his hand resting on his revolver. Go back inside, Harrison. You are drunk and making a fool of yourself. A fool, Vernon laughed bitterly. You are the fool, Irons. You think she is some innocent victim. She is playing you for a sap. That is what women like her do. They bat their eyes and play helpless, and stupid men come running to rescue them. Penelope felt anger surge through her veins, burning away the fear. She stepped around Fletcher and faced her husband directly. You are pathetic, Vernon. You cannot stand that I finally found the courage to leave you, so you lash out with lies and insults. But I am done being afraid of you. I have filed for divorce, and soon I will be free of you forever." Vernon's face turned an ugly shade of purple. "Divorce? You think any judge will grant a whore like you a divorce? I will tell them all about how you were carrying on with this cowboy behind my back, how you abandoned your wifely duties, how you—" He did not get to finish the sentence because Fletcher's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Fletcher stood over him, breathing hard, his eyes blazing with fury. "You will not speak about her that way. Not now, not ever. If I hear that you have been spreading lies about Penelope, if I hear that you have so much as spoken her name in anything other than respectful terms, I will come back to town and finish what I just started. You understand me?" Vernon touched his bleeding lip and glared up at Fletcher with pure hatred. "You will regret this," he hissed. "Both of you will regret this." Fletcher took Penelope's arm and guided her toward where Silver was tied. Several townspeople had gathered to watch the confrontation, their faces showing various mixtures of shock, judgment, and sympathy. Penelope kept her head high as Fletcher helped her mount, refusing to show these people how much their stares affected her. They rode out of town at a quick pace, and it was not until they were well away from San Elizario that Penelope allowed herself to tremble with reaction. Fletcher must have felt it because he pulled Silver to a stop in a grove of trees and dismounted, then helped Penelope down as well. "I am sorry," he said, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I should not have hit him. I just lost my temper when he called you those things." "Do not apologize," Penelope said, covering his hands with her own. "Vernon has had that punch coming for a long time. I am only sorry that you had to be the one to deliver it." Fletcher pulled her into an embrace, and Penelope went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and letting herself take comfort in his strength. His heart beat steadily beneath her ear, and his arms around her felt like the safest place in the world. "I hate that he can still hurt you with his words," Fletcher murmured into her hair. "I hate that he has any power over you at all." "He does not have power over me anymore," Penelope said firmly, pulling back to look up at Fletcher. "I am taking my life back, one step at a time, and I could not do it without you." Fletcher smiled down at her, and then his expression shifted into something more intense, more yearning. His gaze dropped to her lips, and Penelope felt her breath catch as she realized he was going to kiss her. But at the last moment, Fletcher seemed to catch himself. He took a step back, putting proper distance between them, though his hands lingered on her arms. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "That was inappropriate. You are still married, and I should not have presumed." "Fletcher," Penelope interrupted gently, "I wanted you to kiss me." His eyes widened slightly. "Penelope, we cannot. Not while you are still legally bound to Harrison. It would not be right, and it could harm your case for divorce." Penelope knew he was correct, knew that even a hint of impropriety could ruin her chances in court, but knowing something intellectually did not make it any easier to suppress what she felt in her heart. "You are right," she said with a sigh. "I know you are right, but Fletcher, I want you to know that the moment I am free, the very moment the divorce is final, there is nothing I will want more than to be with you properly." Fletcher's eyes blazed with emotion, and he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that was becoming familiar and dear. "Then we will wait," he said. "However long it takes, we will wait. You are worth waiting for, Penelope Harrison." The months that followed were some of the most difficult of Penelope's life, but also some of the most meaningful. The divorce proceedings moved forward at a frustratingly slow pace. Mr. Garrett gathered testimony from Martha and Joe, both of whom bravely agreed to speak about Vernon's abuse. The petition was filed, and a court date was set for early December. In the meantime, Penelope and Fletcher continued their careful dance of propriety and suppressed longing. They maintained separate bedrooms, were never alone together in ways that could be construed as improper, and treated each other with the formality of employer and employee when others were present. But in the privacy of the ranch, in the quiet moments on the porch or working side by side in the garden, their connection deepened. They talked about everything: their hopes for the future, their fears about the divorce, their memories of the past. Fletcher told her about his time in the cavalry, about the battles with the Comanche that had left him with the limp in his left leg and nightmares that sometimes woke him in the middle of the night. Penelope shared her grief over losing her parents and her regret about the years she had wasted with Vernon. They also made plans for the future, tentative and hopeful plans that assumed the divorce would be granted. Fletcher wanted to expand the ranch, maybe buy some more land and increase his herd. Penelope dreamed of making the house more of a home, adding curtains and rugs and all the small touches that transformed a dwelling into something warm and welcoming. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Fletcher suddenly said, "I have been thinking about what I will do if the judge denies your divorce." Penelope's stomach clenched with anxiety. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if the court will not free you from Harrison, then we will need to make a different choice." Fletcher turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "I have family in California, a cousin who runs a ranch in the northern part of the state. He has been asking me for years to come out and work with him. If we cannot dissolve your marriage legally here in Texas, then perhaps we could go to California. Start fresh where no one knows us, where no one would question if we presented ourselves as husband and wife." Penelope stared at him, torn between hope and concern. "Fletcher, that would be living a lie. It would be, well, we would be living in sin." "I know," Fletcher said quietly, "and I do not suggest it lightly. I believe in doing things the right way, the honorable way. But Penelope, I also believe that sometimes the law is wrong. Your marriage to Vernon Harrison is a legal fiction that protects an abusive man and imprisons an innocent woman. If the court will not correct that injustice, then I am prepared to take matters into my own hands." "You would do that for me?" Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You would be willing to leave your ranch, your life here, just so we could be together?" Fletcher reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I would do anything for you, Penelope. I love you." "I should have said it before now, but I did not want to add pressure to everything else you are dealing with. But I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you, however we can make that possible." Tears streamed down Penelope's face as she squeezed his hand tightly. "I love you too, Fletcher. I have loved you for months now, and whatever happens with the divorce, whatever the future holds, I want to face it with you by my side." They sat together on that porch, hands clasped and hearts bound by words that could not be taken back. The future was uncertain, the outcome of the divorce still unknown, but in that moment, Penelope felt a peace she had never known. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The court date arrived in early December. Penelope dressed in her most modest dress and pinned her hair back in a severe style, wanting to present herself as respectable and proper. Fletcher wore his best clothes, looking every inch the honorable rancher he was. The courthouse in San Elizario was packed with curious onlookers, people who had heard about the scandalous divorce case and wanted to see the drama unfold. Penelope tried to ignore the whispers and stares as she took her seat next to Mr. Garrett. Vernon was there with his own lawyer, a slick-looking man from El Paso named Mr. Dawson. Vernon caught Penelope's eye across the courtroom and gave her a smile that made her blood run cold. He looked confident, almost smug, as though he knew something she did not. The judge, an elderly man named Judge Morrison, called the court to order and asked Mr. Garrett to present his case. Penelope's lawyer stood and laid out the argument for divorce clearly and systematically. He called Martha to the stand first, and the older woman testified tearfully about the time she had seen Vernon strike Penelope, the bruises she had helped treat, the tears she had helped dry. Joe the cook testified next, describing an incident where Vernon had beaten Penelope so severely in the kitchen that Joe had thought she might need a doctor. He had confronted Vernon about it and nearly lost his job as a result. Finally, Mr. Garrett called Fletcher to the stand. Fletcher testified about the day he had first witnessed Vernon strike Penelope for dropping a plate, about how he had told her she would never be hit again, and about how he had offered her honest employment and a safe place to live. He was calm and straightforward, answering every question with quiet dignity. When it was Vernon's turn to present his case, Mr. Dawson painted a very different picture. He portrayed Penelope as a faithless wife who had abandoned her husband for another man. He called witnesses who testified that they had seen Penelope and Fletcher riding together, living together, behaving in ways that suggested an improper relationship. Vernon himself took the stand and lied through his teeth, claiming that he had been a devoted husband who occasionally had to discipline his wife for her own good, as was his right. He painted himself as the victim, the wronged man whose wife had betrayed him and now sought to destroy his reputation. Penelope wanted to scream at the injustice of it, but Mr. Garrett kept a reassuring hand on her arm and whispered that they would have a chance to rebut. When both sides had presented their cases, Judge Morrison called for a recess to consider his decision. Penelope, Fletcher, and Mr. Garrett waited in a small room off the main courtroom, the tension almost unbearable. "What do you think?" Penelope finally asked Mr. Garrett. "Will he grant the divorce?" the lawyer sighed. "It is difficult to say. Judge Morrison is known to be conservative in these matters, but we presented strong evidence of abuse. It could go either way." They waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes before they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Morrison looked stern as he surveyed the packed room. "I have considered the evidence and testimony presented in the matter of Harrison versus Harrison," he began. "This court does not take the dissolution of marriage lightly. Marriage is a sacred institution, ordained by God and protected by law. However, this court also recognizes that there are circumstances under which a marriage becomes untenable and should be ended for the welfare of the parties involved." Penelope held her breath, Fletcher's hand finding hers under the table and squeezing tightly. Based on the testimony of multiple witnesses regarding Mr. Vernon Harrison's cruel treatment of his wife, this court finds sufficient grounds to grant the petition for divorce, Judge Morrison continued. "Mrs. Penelope Harrison is hereby released from her marriage vows and restored to the status of an unmarried woman. This court further orders that Mr. Harrison is to have no contact with the former Mrs. Harrison and is prohibited from approaching her or attempting to communicate with her in any way. Should he violate this order, he will be held in contempt of court and subject to arrest." The courtroom erupted in noise, some people cheering, others expressing shock or disapproval. Penelope barely heard any of it over the roaring in her ears. She was free. After years of suffering, after months of uncertainty, she was finally, legally, completely free. She turned to Fletcher, who was grinning broadly despite the tears shining in his eyes. "You did it," he said. "You are free, Penelope." They wanted nothing more than to embrace right there in the courtroom, but propriety held them back. Instead, they shook hands formally with Mr. Garrett, thanked him profusely for his help, and made their way through the crowd toward the door. Vernon tried to intercept them on their way out, his face twisted with rage. "This is not over," he hissed. "You may have fooled that judge, but I know what you really are, both of you." Fletcher stepped forward, his expression hard. "It is over, Harrison. The judge made his decision. If you come anywhere near Penelope, if you so much as speak her name, I will see you arrested. Now get out of our way." Vernon looked like he wanted to argue, but the bailiff had noticed the confrontation and was moving toward them. With a final glare of pure hatred, Vernon turned and stormed out of the courthouse. Penelope and Fletcher walked out into the December sunshine, and Penelope took her first breath as a truly free woman. She looked down at her left hand and slowly removed the gold wedding band that had symbolized her bondage for so long. Without ceremony, she dropped it in the dirt of the street. "Good riddance," she said firmly, and Fletcher laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. They rode back to the ranch in high spirits, talking eagerly about the future that was now open to them. When they arrived home, Fletcher helped Penelope dismount, but this time he did not release her immediately. Instead, he kept his hands at her waist and looked down at her with an expression of such tenderness that Penelope felt her heart might burst. "Penelope," he said softly, "you are free now, truly free. And I know we have talked about the future, about what we might want together, but I want to make sure I am not pressuring you. You have been through so much, and you deserve time to simply be yourself without any man making demands on you." Penelope reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw and the warmth of his skin. "Fletcher Irons, you have been patient with me for months. You have given me safety and kindness and love without asking for anything in return. I do not need time. I know exactly what I want, and what I want is you." Fletcher's eyes darkened with emotion, and this time when he lowered his head toward hers, there was no reason to stop. Their lips met in a kiss that was sweet and passionate and full of all the longing they had been suppressing for so long. Penelope melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as he pulled her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is sudden and we can wait if you want, but Penelope, I have known for months that I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Penelope said without hesitation. "Yes, Fletcher, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in San Elizario. Martha and Joe stood up as witnesses, both of them beaming with happiness for the couple. The preacher who performed the ceremony was the same one who had married Penelope to Vernon 4 years earlier, and Penelope took great satisfaction in having him erase that mistake with these new, joyful vows. When Fletcher kissed her at the end of the ceremony, sealing their union, Penelope felt as though her entire life had been leading to this moment. All the pain and suffering of the past had been worth it to bring her here, to this man, to this love that felt as vast and enduring as the Texas sky above them. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and that night, Fletcher carried Penelope over the threshold of their home with great ceremony. He set her down gently in the main room, and they stood together, simply looking at each other and marveling at the reality of their situation. "You are my wife," Fletcher said wonderingly. "Mrs. Penelope Irons." "I am your wife," Penelope confirmed, and she loved the sound of her new name, loved the way it represented a fresh start and a future filled with hope. "And you are my husband, my kind, brave, wonderful husband." Fletcher swept her back into his arms and carried her down the hall to the bedroom that had been his alone, but would now be theirs together. He set her down beside the bed and looked at her with such love and desire that Penelope felt herself blush. "I want this to be different for you," Fletcher said quietly, his hands coming up to cup her face. "I want to show you what it means to be loved properly, to be cherished. We will go as slowly as you need. If you are nervous or afraid, we can wait." But Penelope was not afraid. For the first time in years, she felt completely safe, completely loved, completely free to give herself to a man who would treasure that gift. "I am not afraid," she said. "Not with you, never with you." They came together in a union that was tender and passionate, everything that Penelope had dreamed marriage could be, but had never experienced until now. Fletcher was gentle with her, attentive to her needs, worshipping her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. And when they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, Penelope felt a completeness she had never known existed. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I will love you for the rest of my life, Fletcher Irons." "And I will love you," Fletcher replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Every day for all our days. You will never be hurt again, Penelope. Not while I draw breath. That is my promise to you." And it was a promise he kept faithfully for all the years that followed. The winter passed peacefully, with the newlyweds settling into their life together. Penelope threw herself into making the house a true home, sewing curtains and quilts, arranging furniture, and filling every room with warmth and care. Fletcher expanded the ranch's operations, buying more cattle and beginning to train horses as he had always wanted to do. In the spring, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little bit of fear. Fletcher worried about Penelope's health, remembering his own mother's difficult pregnancies. But Penelope bloomed with motherhood, growing stronger and more radiant with each passing month. They talked endlessly about the baby, arguing good-naturedly about names and making plans for the future. Fletcher built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth and carving tiny horses into the headboard. Penelope sewed a layette of tiny clothes and blankets, her heart full of anticipation for the new life they had created together. In early November of 1879, their son was born during a spectacular sunset that painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Fletcher held Penelope's hand through the long labor, refusing to leave her side despite the midwife's suggestion that he wait outside. And when their baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling with indignation at being thrust into the world, Fletcher wept openly with joy. They named him Samuel Fletcher Irons, after Fletcher's uncle who had given him the ranch and a second chance at life. Little Samuel had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the moment he was born, he was the center of his parents' world. Penelope proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving with their son. Fletcher was equally devoted, often walking the floor with Samuel in the middle of the night so Penelope could rest, singing old cavalry songs in his rumbling voice until the baby fell back asleep. Life on the ranch was busy but fulfilling. Fletcher's horse training business grew steadily, with ranchers from all over the region bringing their horses to him for breaking and training. Penelope managed the household and raised Samuel, while also maintaining her vegetable garden, which had expanded significantly to provide food for their growing family. Vernon Harrison disappeared from their lives entirely after the divorce. Rumors drifted back to them occasionally that he had sold the saloon and left Texas, heading for parts unknown. Penelope felt only relief at his departure, grateful that he could no longer cast a shadow over her happiness. 2 years after Samuel's birth, Penelope gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose Elizabeth. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and she was as sweet-natured as her brother was mischievous. Fletcher adored his little girl, calling her his desert rose and carrying her everywhere on his broad shoulders. As the children grew, the ranch prospered. Fletcher eventually bought an adjoining property, expanding their holdings significantly. They hired help to manage the increased workload. A young couple named Daniel and Anna who lived in a small house Fletcher built on the far side of the property, and an older man named Tom who helped with the horses and cattle. But despite their growing wealth and success, Fletcher and Penelope never forgot where they had come from or how they had found each other. Every year on the anniversary of the day they met, Fletcher would give Penelope a new plate to replace the one she had dropped in the saloon kitchen. It became a tradition between them, a reminder of how something broken had led to something beautiful. Samuel and Rose grew up strong and happy, surrounded by love and the wide open spaces of the Texas ranch. Samuel inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's quick mind, while Rose had her father's steady temperament and her mother's kind heart. When Samuel was 10 and Rose was 8, Penelope gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Matthew and Marcus. The house was suddenly full of noise and laughter, and the controlled chaos that comes with raising 4 children. Fletcher built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family, adding bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Through it all, Fletcher and Penelope's love never wavered. They had their disagreements, as any married couple does, but they always talked through their problems with respect and care. Fletcher never raised his voice in anger, never raised his hand to his wife or his children. He had learned from his stepfather's cruelty what kind of man he did not want to be, and he worked every day to be the opposite. Penelope flourished in ways she never could have imagined during her dark years with Vernon. She was no longer the frightened, beaten-down woman who had dropped a plate in a saloon kitchen. She was confident, strong, and secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued. As the years passed and their children grew, Fletcher and Penelope would often sit on their porch in the evenings, just as they had when they were first getting to know each other. They would watch the sun set over their land, their hands clasped together, and marvel at the life they had built. "Do you ever think about that day in the saloon?" Penelope asked one evening when they were both in their early 40s and their children were all nearly grown. Fletcher squeezed her hand and smiled. "Every day. It was the day my real life began." "Mine too," Penelope said softly. "You saved me, Fletcher, in every way a person can be saved." "No," Fletcher corrected gently. "You saved yourself by having the courage to leave. I just gave you a safe place to land." "You promised me I would never be hit again," Penelope said, touching his face tenderly. "And you kept that promise. You have kept every promise you ever made to me." "And I always will," Fletcher replied, pulling her close, "for all the days we have left." Samuel eventually took over much of the ranch operations, showing a natural talent for both the cattle and horse businesses. He married a local girl named Sarah, and they built their own house on the ranch property, continuing the legacy Fletcher and Penelope had created. Rose married a young lawyer from El Paso and moved to the city, though she visited the ranch often with her own children. Matthew became a veterinarian, using his skills to help ranchers throughout the region, while Marcus followed in his father's footsteps as a horse trainer. Fletcher and Penelope lived to see their grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, their love story becoming the stuff of family legend. The younger generations would ask to hear about how Grandpa had rescued Grandma from a bad situation, and Fletcher would always tell them that the real hero of the story was their grandmother, who had been brave enough to choose freedom over fear. As they grew old together, their bodies slowing but their hearts still strong, Fletcher and Penelope never lost the sense of gratitude for the life they had built. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had created something beautiful and lasting. Fletcher Irons passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, with Penelope holding his hand and their children gathered around. His last words were the same promise he had made 47 years earlier in a saloon kitchen. "You will never be hurt again." Penelope lived for another 3 years, spending her final days surrounded by the family she and Fletcher had created together. When she passed, she was buried next to her husband on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Penelope Harrison Irons, beloved wife and mother." She chose freedom and found love. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family as a testament to the power of love, courage, and the choice to build something good from the ashes of pain. And every year, on the anniversary of the day Fletcher had first spoken those fateful words, the family would gather at the ranch for a special dinner, always served on beautiful porcelain plates that never broke, reminding them all of where their story began. In the end, Penelope and Fletcher's legacy was not just the land they had built or the children they had raised. It was the proof that even in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the 1878 Texas frontier, love could bloom and flourish, offering hope to anyone brave enough to reach for it. Their story became a beacon for others trapped in difficult situations, a reminder that it was never too late to choose a better life, and that sometimes salvation came in the form of a cowboy who was willing to stand up and say, "You will never be hit again," and mean it with his whole heart.